right, let's start this session. We'll have with us Roger Donway speaking on the Innocence of Samuel Insull, a companion piece to the talk we heard earlier from Rob Bradley. Roger is likely well known to everyone here as former editor of Navigator magazine for many years. Also contributed to its follow-up publication, The New Individualist. Currently is the director of the Business Rights Center, a major initiative at the Atlas Society. And he also has worked closely with Rob Bradley on any number of projects in energy and energy policy. So with that, I'll turn things over to Roger.
Does this work now? Thank you. Okay. Innocence is an ambivalent concept. When we say a person is innocent, we mean he is not guilty of some sin or crime. But when we say a person is an innocent, we mean that he is guilty of dangerous naivete. Samuel Insull, who created the electric utility industry in the United States, was both an innocent and innocent. Because he was an innocent, he found himself dragged into court by the New Deal, facing charges that could have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. Fortunately, a jury found him innocent, and so he escaped that fate. Rob Bradley has told you about Samuel Insull's empire. It had two main pillars: Commonwealth Edison, Chicago's electric utility, and the Public Service Company of Northern Illinois. A tertiary pillar was Middle West Utilities, which was a holding company for utilities all over America, and which was overseen by his brother Martin. More minor to Insull was the Chicago Gas Company, which he had been begged to save, lest its collapse damage Chicago's reputation. More minor still were the elevated subway and trolley systems, which he had also been begged to save. And a mere hobby was the Chicago Opera, which he ran for his pleasure. Clearly, by the end of his career in 1929, Samuel Insull was Mr. Chicago, at a time when Chicago was the second city. But in 1929, Insull would be 70, and he wanted to leave this empire to his son. John D. Rockefeller Jr. had taken over from his father. J.P. Morgan Jr. had taken over from his father. Why shouldn't Samuel Insull Jr. inherit the Insull empire? Well, Jr. was an intelligent young man, but having been born when Insull was 42, he was not a seasoned executive in 1929. In fact, he was just 8 years out of Yale. Owners less partial than Insull's family and friends might oust Jr. when Sam retired. The immediate threat came from Cyrus Eaton. You may remember him as a pinko businessman who won the Lenin Peace Prize in 1960. But as a young man, Eaton threatened only the peace of Samuel Insull, not the peace of the world. He ran a Cleveland investment firm through which he had put together Republic Steel. That done, he turned to utilities. In 1926, Eaton's Continental shares began acquiring gas and electric utilities. Soon enough, his loosely governed conglomerate was the third largest utilities empire in the country, Insull's being number one. Of course, Eaton was merely the owner of his empire, not an owner, entrepreneur, engineer, salesman like Insull. So when Eaton began buying up shares of Commonwealth Edison and Public Service of Northern Illinois, Insull was concerned on several grounds. He didn't want Chicago's utilities owned by Cleveland. He didn't want them owned by someone ignorant of the technology. And he didn't want them owned by someone who would replace his son when he retired. To fend off Eaton, Insull established his own investment firm, Insull Utility Investment Company, or IUI, to buy up shares of the big four Insull utilities. IUI raised money by selling stock to small investors, but Insull's family and friends held a controlling interest. Unfortunately for Insull, the late 1920s speculative fever sent IUI prices soaring, and soon the only people able to afford it were the investment trusts Insull was fighting. For legal reasons, Insull couldn't just sell more shares and bring down the price of IUI securities, so he started the second investment company, Corporation Securities Company of Chicago, CSCC, selling tens of millions of dollars worth of common and preferred stock. But Insull launched his second investment firm on October 4th, 1929. 20 days later, the New York Stock Exchange lost 11% of its value. 4 days after that, it lost an additional 13%. And the day after that, it lost another 12%. In retrospect, we see the crash as the beginning of the Great Depression. But most people didn't see it that way at the time. Utility stocks in particular remained solid, and thus Insull saw no need to alter his plans. In fact, President Hoover himself was urging businessmen to continue with their plans. And Insull, partly because he was an immigrant, but more because he was an innocent, was inordinately proud of having received that urging in person at the White House and having assured the president in person at the White House that he would do his part. So in June 1930, Insull bought out Eaton for $56 million, of which $48 million was borrowed short-term. A man who was director of both Commonwealth Edison and Continental Illinois National Bank had assured Insull that Continental could handle the financing through bank loans until Insull could secure long-term financing. In the event, however, Continental couldn't handle the financing, nor could the other Chicago banks, and Insull was compelled to borrow $20 million from the New York banks, which he had snubbed all his life. As collateral, the New Yorkers took voting stock. But again, we must forego hindsight. During Insull's 48 years in America, 28 had been years of economic panics and downturns. Like many businessmen in 1929, Insull expected a repeat of the 1920-21 Depression. Sharp but short. And in April 1930, recall, the stock market had returned to early 1929 levels, though not to its frenzied peaks. Insull's companies in particular were going great. Earnings in all of 1930 exceeded by 15% the record earnings of 1929. Even during the winter and spring of 1931, Insull securities remained higher than they had been in 1929. For the first 6 months of 1931, earnings were at all-time highs. Then, in the summer of 1931, England went off the gold standard, the banks panicked, and Insull's securities lost $150 million. Insull fought to save his investment companies, but the fight became ever more convoluted, which later looked bad for him. The Chicago banks defaulted to the New York banks, which were out to seize Insull's empire and the bond business it entailed. Using their leverage, the New Yorkers brought in their own auditor, who changed the system under which Insull had flourished for decades, and with a stroke of the pen, Middle West Utilities was declared to be failing. At which point the New Yorkers made sure it did not get a small loan it needed, and Middle West Utilities went into receivership. But the pillars of Insull's empire, Commonwealth Edison, Public Service of Northern Illinois, and People's Gas, were still solid. They could have endured another decade of depression and never missed a dividend. There was $60 million in notes falling due in July, but Insull's long-term bond company was set to cover it. The New Yorkers, however, persuaded Insull's outside directors that the company's ability to borrow depended upon Insull's departure. And so on June 6, 1932, Insull signed 62 letters of resignation, one for each of his positions. He stayed in town for a week in case he was needed, but no call came. Then, without fanfare, he went to Europe for a rest, as he always did, sailing from Quebec to France. A little later, his wife joined him, and they settled down to live in obscurity in Paris. Although he owed more than he owned, his pension was $50,000 a year, and his wife would get half of that after his death. Well, let me leave the Insulls in their Paris refuge and flash back to tell you about the enemies Insull made during his lifetime. As we have seen, there were the New York bankers. Insull had avoided them ever since they seized the company of his idol, Thomas Edison. Tellingly, when he built his headquarters skyscraper in the shape of an enormous throne, it faced west. But though the New York bankers wanted Insull's business, they did not hate him. That was left to his political enemies. And without these political enemies, it is unlikely that Insull would ever have been brought to trial. These were political progressives who could not believe that Insull's profit-driven utilities could possibly serve the public good. Insull, being an innocent, could not believe that political attacks on his utilities were anything but temporary election-time demagoguery. But these were. Foremost among Insull's enemies was Donald Richburg, born in 1881 and so only 11 when Insull came to Chicago to take over its utility industry. Richburg attended the University of Chicago and Harvard Law, but barely graduated from them. His father, however, had a solid law practice in Chicago, and after Harvard, Donald joined the firm. But he didn't like it. A lawyer's job, he proclaimed, was serving the public interest, not necessarily his client's interests. In 1905, at age 24, Richburg joined a group of Chicago progressives that included Jane Addams, Charles E. Merriam, a professor of political science at the university, and another young lawyer named Harold Ickes. From that point on, Richburg's life revolved around three things: elections, opposing big business, and writing anti-capitalist novels in which he was the thinly disguised hero. In 1915, Richburg's father suffered a stroke, and an enormous family financial burden fell on Donald. To give him credit, he would still take nothing but public interest work. Through his friend, Professor Merriam, then an alderman, Richburg was appointed special counsel for the city's gas litigation. And so from 1915 through the mid-1920s, Richburg was involved in several stratagems against the gas company, which is to say against Samuel Insull. But all of them failed. The result, says Richburg's biographer, was that Samuel Insull, quote, provided Richburg with the very kind of symbol that epitomized the evils which he saw in the business world. Somewhat later, Richburg began doing legal work for railway unions, and this led to an incident that was the most traumatizing of his life, although its relevance to Insull's life emerged only later. During the Great War, the railway unions had won concessions to keep goods moving. After the war, they feared a reversal of that trend and advocated a continued nationalization of the roads. But in March 1920, the government returned the roads to their owners and established a railroad labor board to oversee wage and other disputes. During the Depression of 1920-21, the railroads applied to the RLB for reductions in wage rates, which were granted. When the roads got another wage reduction in June 1922, strike ballots were sent out. But not all the unions were affected by this last wage reduction, and only 7, representing 400,000 shop workers, went out on strike on July 1st. Coincidentally, however, the mine workers had gone on strike in April, and John L. Lewis cheered on the railroad workers, hoping their stoppage of coal deliveries would strengthen his own coal strike. This combined miners' shop workers strike became one of the bloodiest in American history, encompassing many murders of non-union workers. Yet some law enforcement officials with links to the working class refused to prosecute union crimes or protect non-union workers. Eventually, President Harding decided to act. His Attorney General went to Chicago, where the shop workers union was headquartered, and got a sweeping injunction in federal court that stopped the strike cold. For Richburg, this became a searing symbol of the establishment power he hated. But nothing could be done. The strike was settled, and Richburg turned out another thinly disguised novel with himself as hero. A second Insull enemy was a slightly older progressivist, Harold L. Ickes. If the name sounds familiar, it's because his son, Harold M. Ickes, is the Clintons' political advisor. Ickes graduated from the University of Chicago in 1897 and took his law degree there in 1907, but he never did much legal work. Instead, he became a perennial campaigner for progressivist candidates at all levels, and in that way became part of Richburg's circle of progressives. At that time, remember, progressives were the left wing of the Republican Party, and their hero was Teddy Roosevelt. In 1912, when TR lost the Republican nomination, he bolted to form the Progressive Party, and Wilson won with only 42% of the vote. Cannily, Wilson then stole every plank of the progressive platform: the income tax, the Federal Reserve System, and above all, the Clayton Antitrust Act. Consequently, in 1914's election, progressives lost half of their 10 House seats. In 1916, Ickes plotted to nominate TR again on the progressive ticket, but though he secured the nomination, Roosevelt declined it, leaving Ickes thoroughly depressed. Early in 1917, however, his spirits revived when the United States entered the Great War. Not only did Ickes approve of the war, he wanted a big part in it. The vehicle nearest at hand was the Illinois Council of Defense, devoted to selling war bonds and keeping factories running at top speed. But the man who had been picked to run that council was, who else? Mr. Competent Samuel Insull. Insull brushed off Ickes' pleas for employment, but common friends eventually pestered Insull into letting Ickes run some low-level neighborhood councils. That left Ickes both dissatisfied and furious with Insull. Says Ickes' biographer, "A world without something in it to make him angry would have been incomprehensible to him." In 1927, Ickes found something that made him even more angry than usual, and once again, it was Samuel Insull. Insull was already running the elevated system in Chicago, and when the streetcar companies edged toward collapse, the city fathers begged him to take over the entire traction system. Insull had his aides draw up enabling legislation for the unification, restoration, and improvement of the subway surface and elevated systems. All the major political forces favored the legislation, as did labor. But the matter was complicated by the Chicago politicians' need to denounce the plan, even as they supported it. Things then got more complicated when downstate legislators thought the Chicago politicians were serious and demanded money from Insull to pass his legislation. Insull never paid political extortion money or bribes, and so told them to go to hell, throwing the whole mess back into the politicians' laps. In 1929, an independent commission recommended essentially the same plan Insull had proposed, and legislation was passed giving Insull near-dictatorial powers to put it into effect. At which point, naturally, Ickes and Richburg and their friends organized the People's Traction League to fight Insull's plan through a July 1930 referendum. Predictably, they lost, 5-1. But to quote Ickes' biographer again, his need for villains was quite as powerful as his need for heroes. And from 1929 on, Samuel Insull was villain number one for Harold Ickes and Donald Richburg. Then there was Insull's most powerful enemy. New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt fancied himself knowledgeable about utilities economics and went so far as to publish articles on the subject in reputable magazines. Martin Insull, violating Brother Samuel's policy of ignoring political demagoguery, felt compelled to show Roosevelt up for a fool. And of course, Roosevelt never forgot it. So those were the major enemies Insull had made by the time he reached Paris in the summer of 1932. As was traditional, the Democratic presidential candidate, FDR, launched his campaign on Labor Day, September 5th, 1932. And a large part of his strategy was to attract the old progressive Republican vote that had gone for his wife's uncle, Teddy. To that end, he gave major campaign roles to both Richburg and Ickes. How much they contributed to his attacks on Insull is hard to say, but FDR would have been a willing pupil. On September 21st, 1932, Roosevelt gave a speech in Oregon attacking the power industry generally. What prevents our American people from taking full advantage of this great economic and human agency? The reason is, frankly and definitely, that many selfish interests in control of light and power industries have not been sufficiently far-sighted to establish rates low enough to encourage widespread public use. If you heard Rob's talk, you can imagine how insane that was. Of course, widespread and low-priced power had been the essence of Insull's career. On September 23rd in San Francisco, Roosevelt attacked Insull directly. Whenever in the pursuit of his objective, the lone wolf, the unethical competitor, the reckless promoter, the Ishmael or Insull, whose hand is against every man's, declines to join in achieving an end recognized as being for the public welfare, and threatens to drag industry back to a state of anarchy, the government may properly be asked to apply restraint. In September also, legal proceedings began when the state's attorney for Cook County, John Swanson, a Republican running for re-election in what promised to be a Democratic year, announced an investigation of the Insull collapse. Swanson told his son-in-law, "Sam Insull is the greatest man I've ever known. No one has done more for Chicago, and I know he has never taken a dishonest dollar. But Insull knows politics, and he will understand." The next day, September 23rd, Progressive Republican Senator Peter Norbeck, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, announced hearings into the Insull empire. The day after that, the U.S. Attorney for Northern Illinois announced that he was launching a federal investigation. Of course, Insull won the election on November 8th, and on March 4th, 1933, his first inaugural address declared...
Roosevelt, not Insull.
Thank you. I wish. But he was an immigrant, so he couldn't. Of course, Roosevelt won the election on November 8th, and on March 4th, 1933, his first inaugural address declared, "The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit." Harold Ickes was appointed to the Roosevelt cabinet, and Donald Richburg acquired so much power in the administration that the New York Times called him the assistant president. Under the new administration, then, fresh resources poured into the federal prosecution. Justice and Treasury accounting specialists were sent to analyze the mountains of corporate records, and the new Attorney General sent in the country's hottest prosecutor, Leslie Salter, to take over from the local U.S. attorney. Now let me return to Insull in Paris and to his perspective on these events. In September 1932, FDR was attacking Insull by name, and prosecutors were opening investigations. In early October, Junior came with the news that his father would be indicted. Obviously, that was very bad news. Not only was a fair trial unlikely, but the strain might be too much for a man approaching his 74th birthday. So Insull decided to go to Greece, which had no extradition treaty with America. Leaving his wife temporarily in Paris, father and son journeyed to this new refuge, after which Junior returned to Chicago. At that point, I think the cases against Insull would simply have awaited his death, had his enemies not held power in Washington. But they did. Under pressure from the new U.S. administration, Greece quickly passed an extradition treaty. But the deportation was limited to actions that were crimes under Greek law. During the course of 1933, Greece held 3 deportation trials to expel Insull, but 3 times his defense prevailed. Furious, the Roosevelt administration told influential Greek Americans that they would no longer be allowed to send money to relatives back in the old country unless they pressured Athens to kick Insull out. That worked. But it was an expulsion, not an extradition. And the deadline for it was extended for medical reasons until March 15, 1934. FDR's extra-legal action made Insull even more skeptical about receiving a fair trial. So borrowing money from friends, he chartered a small ship to cruise the eastern Mediterranean in search of another refuge. On March 22nd, the House and Senate rushed through a bill authorizing the State Department to arrest an American citizen in any country where the United States had extraterritorial rights. Time magazine pronounced it a great day for FDR and called Insull a sniveling old man. This new legal authority came into play on March 29th when Insull's ship passed through the Bosporus, and Turkish forces commandeered it to Istanbul. America's ambassador persuaded Ankara to seize Insull, and the fugitive was held in a small jail cell. On April 2nd, 1934, Turkey denied Insull's appeal to stay in Turkey, and he was transported under guard to the Aegean coast. The next week, President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull signed a warrant authorizing the third Secretary of the American Embassy, Burton Berry, to bring Insull home. On April 13th, the two men boarded the SS Excelona to begin the 24-day journey back. Relieved to be out of jail, Insull greeted Berry jovially. But as the journey progressed, depression set in, and Insull confided his thoughts of suicide to Berry. But his sympathetic young guardian convinced him that it would be taken as an admission of guilt. As the Excelona approached New York, Samuel Insull Jr. boarded and gave his father a prepared statement for the press. It said, "I have erred, but my greatest error was in underestimating the effect of the financial panic on American securities, and particularly on the companies I was working hard to build." Insull continued, "I worked with all my energy to save those companies. I made mistakes, but they were honest mistakes. They were errors in judgment, but not dishonest manipulations." On May 9, 1934, Insull arrived with federal agents in Chicago. Jr. had arranged to pay the expected $100,000 bail, but the court suddenly demanded $200,000. Insull's lawyer, Floyd Thompson, offered to make bail, but Insull wanted to spend the night in jail to demonstrate the government's overzealousness. And indeed, the publicity attending the jailing incident was the first step in transforming the image of Insull from that of a swindler to that of a former benefactor, now persecuted for the sins of his generation. Well, let me leave Insull in jail for a while and present another flashback. Not to a villain this time, but to a hero. The judge in Insull's trial, James H. Wilkerson. Wilkerson was born in 1869, graduated from DePauw in 1889, and was admitted to the bar in 1893. Apart from his private practice, he was state attorney for Cook County, 1903-04, special assistant to the U.S. Attorney General, 1906 to 1911, and U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois from 1911 to 1914. In 1922, Wilkerson was nominated by President Harding to be a U.S. District Judge for the Northern District of Illinois and was immediately confirmed by the Senate. As chance would have it, Wilkerson was no sooner seated in July 1922 than the U.S. Attorney General approached him for a restraining order that would stop a strike of railroad shop workers. They asked James Wilkerson, whom was the judge whom I occasionally avoided naming earlier when I described Donald Richburg's involvement with the railroad strike. But he it was. And now perhaps you can see the upshot. Richburg thrived on hatred, and after the railroad strike, Judge Wilkerson was an object of that hatred, second only to Insull. Wilkerson was no tool of the Republican administrations, however. One case makes the point. During those administrations, Commerce Secretary Hoover began to impose his theory of associationalism on the economy. Its essence was fundamental cooperation among business groups with marginal competition, sort of second cousin to Mussolini's fascism. And nowhere was Hoover's imposition of associationalism more active than in the new field of radio broadcasting. Hoover thought that obviously broadcasters must cooperate, or radio wave interference would render the enterprise impossible. But in 1926, Zenith Radio began operating on a frequency other than the one Hoover had assigned it, and Wilkerson ruled that Hoover simply had no power to regulate broadcasters. Wilkerson also presided over another historic case. In June 1931, Al Capone appeared in his courtroom with a plea bargain that would get him only 2.5 years in prison. Wilkerson rejected the bargain and set a trial date. Nothing daunted, Capone got a list of prospective jurors and began passing out $1,000 bills. Word got back to Wilkerson, and when the trial began on October 5, 1931, Wilkerson told his bailiff that a fellow judge had another trial just beginning. He ordered the bailiff to bring that other judge's entire panel of prospective jurors to his courtroom, taking his panel to the other judge. Capone was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years. In January 1932, now President Hoover, bearing no grudge against Wilkerson, nominated him to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. During Senate confirmation hearings, however, Donald Richburg testified vehemently about the injunction of 10 years earlier, and his campaign of hatred was successful. In December 1932, Wilkerson reluctantly asked Hoover to withdraw his nomination, and he returned to his district court seat. So it was that in October 1934, when Samuel Insull was dragged into court by the Roosevelt administration, where Richburg now reigned as assistant president, the man on the district court bench was none other than James H. Wilkerson. Poetic justice indeed. During the trial, Judge Wilkerson made 4 pro-defense rulings. I do not say they were wrong, but an unsympathetic judge could have ruled otherwise. His first pro-defense ruling allowed Insull's team to reserve its opening statement until after the prosecution had rested. Obviously, that allowed it to focus narrowly on the prosecution's best arguments. That argument was straightforward. In 1928-29, Insull realized he didn't control enough stock in his operating companies to prevent a takeover. He therefore created 2 investment companies through which he could control the utilities. The securities of both were touted as specializing in public utility stocks and essentially failure-proof. Insull and his fellow schemers went on to sustain the price of the stock until it was all sold, after which they cooked the books to continue the illusion of profitability. By 1932, however, the shares had lost all value. The purchasers had been defrauded of $100 million. The defense had 2 responses. The first was Insull's incredible life and what it said about his character. As Insull told his story at considerable length, the prosecutor naturally objected. I have been hoping all afternoon that counsel would get down to the issue in this case, which is false representation of values to the public. To which defense lawyer Thompson replied, the strongest test I know of a man's actions in the later years of his life is the character in him during the time he is building his life. Wilkerson could easily have sustained the objection by reminding Thompson that character can be attested by character witnesses. But his second pro-defense decision, Wilkerson overruled the prosecution and allowed Insull to continue weaving his spell. Insull described his arrival in Chicago, the growth of Chicago Edison and Commonwealth Edison, the spread of electricity to the suburbs and the countryside and then to the entire nation. He told how he had saved the gas company and the city rail lines, and he spoke with deep emotion of his wartime service. Then Insull described the formation of the investment companies and the complications arising from the crash. The general attitude was that it was a stock market episode, serious in its character, but could not have any decided effect upon the business of the country. That, he admitted, turned out wrong. His most crucial error, he said, was his failure to make friends with the great New York bankers. The second stage of the defense lay in Insull's ability to endure cross-examination. Salter tore into him about an annual report that had gone through 8 drafts. Wasn't it because the first draft showed a deficit? Weren't you trying to mislead the public? Insull answered furiously, no, sir, we were not. Salter asked about a sales flyer declaring CSCC had 80 million in assets. What you meant was, dear investor, if you buy all these units we are offering at the price we are offering, then we will have 80 million in cash and assets. Pounding his knee, Insull replied, no, sir, I didn't mean any such thing. And he tried to summarize the process by which securities were underwritten before being sold. A neutral author has said that Insull's performance under cross-examination helped him even more than his performance on direct. When the two sides had finished their summations, Judge Wilkerson instructed the jury. Explaining the fraud statute, he said, a person has a right not to be subjected to a risk which the other party to the transaction fraudulently induces him to believe does not exist. It does not matter if the deceiver himself has great expectations for the plan and intends that the person deceived shall lose nothing. Likewise, a person cannot use false representations to obtain money, even though he himself at the same time risked his own money in the enterprise. That last point told heavily against the defense, for it had argued many times that the defendants obviously did not intend to fraud because they had lost huge sums in the deal, and in some cases had lost everything. However, the judge ameliorated his instruction by adding, the investment of his own money may be considered on the question of knowledge and intent in making the representations which it is charged were false. Judge Wilkinson's next instruction was his third statement in favor of the defense. He stressed vigorously that a person may not be convicted of fraud simply because his business judgment was atrocious. There must be the underlying purpose and intent to deceive and defraud, he said. In his fourth and last major action favoring the defense, Judge Wilkerson told the jury that a company was permitted to use any valid accounting procedure. Those were the days. No SEC, no generally accepted accounting principles. If the jury was convinced by the testimony of professional accountants that the defendant's method was rational and objective, then the defendant had a right to use that method. The jury retired on November 24th at 2:20 p.m. and returned 2 hours later. Judge Wilkerson asked, have you reached a verdict, Mr. Foreman? We have, was the reply. Hand it to the clerk. In a loud voice, Clerk Joseph O'Sullivan read the single, simple sentence, we, the jury, find the defendants not guilty. In the words of his best biographer, Forrest MacDonald, for his 53 years of labor to make electric power universally cheap and abundant, Insull had his reward from a grateful people. He was allowed to die outside prison.
Okay. So is it your view that in the 20s and 30s, the fundamental pattern of populist politics in the U.S. got broken? The thing that Insull had been accustomed to then didn't happen the way it had happened in the past? So the question is, in the story, Insull's enemies marshal political power and crush him, and his business schemes fall apart, whereas in the past he'd weathered depressions and populist politicians, etc., without trouble. Right. So how did it change? His business practice? Is it just that the politics changed? Had his business practices changed in the very last part of his career?
Well,
that's the question.
His continuing to proceed with business as usual in the face of the crash obviously had a very bad effect on his investment companies. Whether his utility companies could have survived is a question. The main ones probably could have. What changed was the coming to power of progressivism, the coming to national power of progressivism. He had always been able to deal with the state progressives. The ones like Richburg and Ickes were very minor on the scene. They had almost no political power. The people who did have political power took a much more rational approach to business. They didn't hate it or think it evil. They might want to regulate it, control it, or whatever. So, yeah, it fundamentally changed with the coming to power of the New Deal.
One thing I may have missed, what brought Insull to the attention of Roosevelt? Why was Roosevelt attacking him in his campaign speeches?
Well, one major thing was that Roosevelt began publishing articles on the electric utility industry. And his brother Martin, who ran Middle West Utilities, the third major pillar of the empire, wrote articles that really devastated Roosevelt's arguments. Insull's brother. Did I say Roosevelt's brother again? Martin Insull replied. He wrote articles back. For example, Roosevelt wrote a long article saying, look, in the United States, we have privately owned utilities. The householder rates are much more expensive. If we look across to Ontario, they have publicly owned utilities. The householder rates are much cheaper. And Martin Insull wrote back and said, well, one, Ontario is able to use ultra-cheap hydropower, whereas almost everybody in the United States has to burn expensive coal. And two, the householder rates are being demagogically kept down, and the politicians are soaking industry. The proper way to do it is this two-tier method, that my brother Martin, my brother Samuel discovered. You charge people for what they use in terms of peak and average. Sure, naturally, you have a hydropower utility industry who's demagogically soaking industry and pushing down householder rates, you're going to have lower householder rates. But the way to do it is to charge people what they cost. So the Insulls were not obviously high on his list of favorites. And then when Insull's empire went smash, he said, this is a perfect example of all the evils of the capitalist system that I've been pointing out. Selfish, and of course, Ickes and Richburg had large roles in his campaign, and I'm sure they were feeding him, information about it.
If I could make some comments, you're probably a little perplexed. Insull has 150 companies or so. Virtually all of them are profitable, even after the Great Depression, but he goes bust. And what Insull did late in his career that was very speculative and really for bad reasons was he wanted to create a legacy for himself and a family dynasty. So he creates the holding companies that are buying stock at a peak time in the Great Depression is lowering the value of these stocks. So even though all the companies are profitable, the speculative nature of the two holding companies makes it go bust. And Insull pledged everything personally behind these loans, and he went from a billionaire to virtually penniless. Now, the one thing that Roger mentioned when Insull first went bankrupt, he had a nice pension. $50,000 a year in the 1920s is a lot of money. but then they revoked the pension because public pressure was so bad that Commonwealth Edison ended it. So his son was going over to Europe with a suitcase full of cash so the old man could live. That's how bad it was. And Insull died virtually penniless, and when they finally settled his estate, creditors got 1/100 of 1 penny. So you have, one of the richest men in the world that is virtually penniless. So it's quite a story.
That was a great story, Roger. In your telling, you mentioned the large number of personal enemies, and it sounds like much of the trial was motivated by personal animosities. I'm wondering if there was kind of also a symbolic value to his trial, and that at least from the progressivist perspective, there's all kinds of bad actors in operating in business in the 20s, and we need someone to blame for the Great Depression. So if we can get one major industrialist and use him as an example, that will serve political purposes. So in your judgment, how much of it was symbolic, how much of it was personal, and how much of it actually motivated by argues about financial improprieties?
Well, the investigations began September 32, and they were almost forced to begin because of the collapse of the two big investment companies. The utilities, the underlying utilities were solid at that point. But the two investment companies had collapsed and people had lost, and particularly people in the Chicago area had lost $100 million. And small investors, because they wanted to sell to small investors, rather than big investors, because they wanted to have control of the investment company. Anyway, so the investigations almost were bound to begin. But when he left for Greece, which had no extradition treaty, if anybody but Roosevelt had been in, I think that would have been it. They just would have said, oh, well, we'll let him die in Greece, just like in the backdated adoption scandal. Kobe Alexander is now in Namibia, which has no extradition treaty, and he's been there for over 10 years. But Roosevelt did all sorts of things to get him out. Now, it's true, there's almost nobody else comparable to Insull for actually bringing legal action against a businessman after the crash and the Depression. The president of the New York Stock Exchange was tried for something, for some fraud. But compared to the smash of the Insull empire, that was really small potatoes. So Insull was really it as a symbol. There's really nobody else. So yes, he was symbolic. He was a perfect symbol for the New Deal. And there was nobody comparable. It was perfect.
I might mention that the FDR-Insull animosity is now going on between Obama and the Koch empire. But the Koch empire really hasn't done much wrong. So there wasn't a huge bankruptcy that the party in power can use against the Kochs. But it's an interesting analogy.
You can imagine what would happen if the Kochs went bankrupt and people lost hundreds of millions of dollars.
So, Roger, what was the effect on Roosevelt and his administration once Samuel Insull was declared innocent by the jury? Was there any political blowback on Roosevelt?
No. By that time, the Chicago paper, the Chicago Tribune, had one of the Chicago papers had a big headline: "Insull innocent, old order guilty." It was taken that, okay, he was a good guy, he was a great man, he was a great industrialist. Turns out, 12 men, good and true, found that he had not committed fraud. And there were actually 3 trials, and he had gone through 3 Greek trials. He went through 3 American trials, all innocent, 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 innocent. People finally said, okay, I guess it was just a really bad business judgment. He was not a fraudster.
However, there was some federal legislation. The Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, the Securities and Exchange Commission Act of 3334. I think they're 2 different laws. The Federal Power Act to regulate interstate transmission of electricity in 1938. So you get all this intervention that occurs during the New Deal that has something or a lot to do with Insull. And there's parallels between Insull and Enron. The accounting company that came in to change the books was
Arthur Andersen.
Arthur Andersen, okay? And that accounting company died because of Enron. And out of Enron came a lot of federal regulation as well, such as Sarbanes-Oxley. So history repeats itself.
One thing that came out again was the SEC developed these generally accepted accounting principles. They weren't going to allow, again, someone to come in with his own professors of accounting and say, my way was fine. They're going to make it really tough to violate federally accepted accounting practices. So, yeah, a lot of things came out of it, but there was certainly no negative. No one said, oh, FDR was really bad to do that. No, not at all. Okay. Thank you.